Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you had a good day in Belize. We finally got the perfect day for our going ashore and seeing all kinds of things, including, I'm sure some of you went to one or more of the Mayan ruins, which are down near here. In fact, there are many all through this whole area. And part of the pleasure of coming to this part of the world is that we encounter a civilization that was all but lost and is still living, and it's been called one of the great originating civilizations on Earth, except that it got buried in the jungle and its own people were pretty much vanquished. They had a tremendous population loss, and many of their evidence were either lost or buried. The Spanish, when they first came, particularly the priests, we were amazed to encounter such an advanced culture, in some ways more advanced than Europe was at the time. But in time, the heritage of the Maya had been, first of all, internally destroyed pretty much. The great cities, the great engineering constructions fell to warfare, deforestation, depopulation, and so even when the Spanish came, it was already a faded culture that had been since subsumed into the Aztec and Mixtec and other empires of other native peoples in this whole area. So I'm by no means a scholar of the Maya, but I've been to the area many times. I've been to many sites, and the more you know and the more you've been, the more intriguing it gets, because they're still finding things currently that are quite surprising. So I'm going to give you kind of a look at some of these aspects of it. You're, of course, familiar that this was the whole Mesoamerica civilization that, at least under the Aztec and other empires, stretched all the way up the far coast of Mexico, what is now Mexico, and up into the plains of even, they had contact and trade with the Mississippian Native Americans in previous centuries before, when Columbus and then the Great Impact happened. But the Yucatan is the main site of many of the major sites that have been found, but this is a very unusual place. Now, we've already been to Guatemala. Now we're up on the coast of Belize, and we're continuing up to the Costa Maya up there. That's where that port will be. But all through that area, particularly the further north you go, the more you get evidence of the Mayan constructions. Now, this is also very dramatic geologically, because you have high mountains and you have an ocean shore, another one on the other coast. So in its geography, it produced a civilization because they had many different products that were not that very far. You can see here cacao, salt, cotton, bird feathers, basalt for building, obsidian and various jewels and things that were very precious to them. So this was, above all, a trading empire, and they built very well-constructed roadways up to, they found one recently that's 100 kilometers long, perfectly straight between one former city and then another one. And this had never been seen before, but they had, now they're using satellite and aerial, what they call LIDAR, which is ground sensing radar, and they're finding a vast evidence of cities of over up to 1 million people. So this was a big place, perhaps bigger than any cities in Europe back in its height of its time. The land itself, though, is very curious, because on the Pacific coast on the left here, you have a rising mountains and volcanoes and earthquakes, and it's very unstable. And then as it goes down toward the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, you have the remains of an uplifted limestone seabed that is riddled with caves and has great underground water system in it. And then the contrast between them led to quite a variety of people and trade along these other areas. All these little red dots are designated archaeological sites. So even in Belize, there are quite a few, but you see the greatest number are up in the far north of Yucatan around Merida and other areas where Chichen Itza and other great cities had once been flourishing. Nowadays, this whole area, which you could call Maya land, with the Mayan people and their various groups, all the way from El Salvador, Honduras, all the way up into Mexico, Guatemala, Belize. they are divided between these different countries as a result of the Spanish conquest and the politics of these times, so that Central America was never unified as a one nation, just like the Mayans were never unified as one nation. But what they call La Ruta Maya is a joint effort in this whole area to provide roads and then facilities so that this culture is appreciated and it becomes an attraction, and you can get in and go see these various sites. And now you can drive, if you have a car, all the way through the area fairly easily, and it's not either so far nor too dangerous. And a lot of it has had a lot of preservation for the forest and the ruins. Now, everybody has seen these pictures, Palenque, and some of the details of the carvings and the inscriptions, and each site is somewhat different than any other one, though they all have a pyramidal structure like this. And these were definitely the ceremonial homes and altars for the priesthood and the royalty. There were vast cities down below in thatched huts like we've seen here. The common people didn't live in such magnificent masonry work, but that's what has remained, including some of these beautiful archways in Labna and other sites. The most famous is the Castillo, they call it in Spanish, the Culucan at Chichen Itza, which is a perfectly symmetrical square pyramid like this, and with the Chacmo, who's the god of rain, from the plaza overlooking the mount. In Uxmal, there's another very steep platform pyramid, and there are many more they haven't excavated, because the more they excavate, the more they have to upkeep them, and the more they tend to get weathered. So they have cataloged thousands of sites that they don't plan to, let's say, clean up and open to the public. This is also in Uxmal, the House of the Doves, where they believe they used to keep birds all through that upper structure as sort of an aviary for reasons unknown. If anybody went to Nimli Punit, that was on one of the tours today. This is a smaller ceremonial site, but typically it has a courtyard that was used for playing games, and then the altars, and then the upper residences, usually of the local lord. And all of this has been recorded in stele and stone carvings. Now, the Mayans developed a very advanced language, but they did not have any paper or papyrus. They always carved it in stones, and so it was almost invariably very, let's say, official documents of who was ruling and what their victories and what their qualities are. And for many decades, there was very little knowledge, because the local Mayan could not read it in recent centuries. They had lost their thread of literacy to read these complicated logogryphs, and the spoken language has remained to this day. But now they keep finding more. We're going to go to this one tomorrow, Cohunlic, up in Quintana Roo, Mexico. And this is a modest-sized ruin, not one of the more spectacular ones, but it's not far from where we dock, with, again, the ceremonial center. It has a maze to get into it, though, so it's probably also a fortified town with its ceremonial center. And so the walls are imposing, but until you go walking around, you often don't feel this is more than just a big pile of rocks, until you also can appreciate what might have been there. So back in the 1850s, when the first outsiders began to research these ruins, one of them wrote, "I just wish I could have the ghosts tell me what all this is saying to me," because it was such a mystery. It was not until a couple of decades ago that they could pick apart the language. Now, this is comparable, let's say, to Egyptian studies, where it took so long until you had the Rosetta Stone to translate ancient Egyptian. There's been no real Rosetta Stone in Middle America, but they've, by different analysis, been able to get a fairly good idea what those stela say. This, again, is that same place we're going to go tomorrow, and the remains of one of the great arches up above. This particular site is well known for these unusual large faces that are built into the walls, and have a lot of imagery in the detail, particularly those googly eyes. This may have been the first Google search fellow. Who knows? Because none of this, there's no record and nobody remembers. So that's why it was considered maybe an insignificant civilization, because it had no follow-through into living civilization, at least in a general sense. This is the most steep and stunning of all of the the great altars. This is in Tikal, which is in far northern Guatemala, where you have to fly in to get there, and it's in a large forest preserve of Petén. So it doesn't have anybody living around the area. It's not accessible readily. This Copan is actually near where we were in Guatemala. It's over the border in Honduras. But this is one of the samples of what one of the kings named 18th Rabbit put up a monument to himself for some victory. They were terribly warlike. That was the comment, that the Mayan culture was fascinated by warfare. And so almost all these stelae, this is the one we saw yesterday in Quirigua, they're always a triumphant war monument. And then they can be described, if you can decipher the numbers and the different logographics, which often have animal or human forms that are identifiable as some either a noun or a number or some context for all these inscriptions. They have them also in caves, painted. Again, they didn't have any paper or papyrus or anything like that to use, so they would always just have it as an inscriptions or a painting. So these, of course, they look like cartoon figures, but over time they were able to decipher, particularly because this Bishop Diego de Landa in 1566, as a Jesuit, he took it upon himself to try to describe some of this, even as a lot of the records in the culture was being, let's say, vanquished right during those times between the diseases and the warfare. And so these are kept as keys to try to understand that language, which also the Spanish had taken Mayan scribes and asked them to write and draw these things in what they call the codex, which was actually a large papyrus, or I'm sorry, parchment documents that the Spanish commissioned to try to get them to describe things to them. So this one's in Madrid. There's a few major ones that are in museums in Mexico and in places in Europe and in the United States around. But this was the kind of language they had. They had a 20 base number system. So they started with 2, 10 times 2 is 20, and then 40, 400, 4,000. They also had a 0. And the only other ancient culture that had a 0 was traditional Indian. Sanskrit has been credited with inventing the 0, which meant you could also just add zeros on the ends of things. You remember how Roman numerals were so cumbersome because there was no 0. You'd have to have all these letters out there, and you still didn't have the flexibility that the Mayan had. And then they had these kind of glyphs or logos that were significant of different names or actions, and so these changed over time as if the cartoonists were running the language. They would reduce things into different things. So here's one that was in the early classical was complicated. They simplified it on the right side, so east, north, south, west, and south. They tried to make the language a little more accessible to perhaps more people, not unlike how modern Chinese has been simplified to a bit of a less elegant language, and perhaps they thought that way too. But you can imagine in these rocky ruins where we go to visit, the structure of the society was all around the priesthood and the royalty and the local lords, and everyone else was either a supplicant or a servant or a slave. And like many other ancient civilizations, the development sort of paired a technological introductions, a linguistic introductions, cruelty, warfare, and then a dominant class usually. You can see this priest with his long fingernails, and he's being served and attended to by all these different people. This became kind of I would call a cosmic dictatorship, because the priesthood had this conception of the world that it was a large monster that came in different forms and different ways to assault the humans who were on one plane in the middle world. And then there was the world tree. You see that in the middle above the cardinal square. This was the source of all life that connected heaven and earth and humans in the middle, and the roots went down into the underworld that they called Uplaba, which was this terrifying place that you wanted to avoid going. But it was pretty complicated. They had all these different layers and rituals and gods. And so if you want to consider religion as a projection of human imagination, this was one of many around the world. But the fantastic qualities of it were unbelievable when they were first found. Now this is a mural of the Tree of Life, and it's not unlike the Old Norse tradition of Asgard, the Tree of Life, or it's in Old Norse, so that worshiping trees has always been a part of maybe all human history. Think about it when you light your, go home and have a Christmas tree. But this was considered to be the source of all life. Of course, they're living in a tropical environment, and even today our guide was pointing out tree after tree and all the things that they could do. But it was considered the duty of humans to feed the tree of life and the future of the world by bloodletting, because the word in Maya for blood, human blood, was the same as the sap of a tree. And so this ritual behaviors were developed over time. I'm not sure whether it was completely pervasive, but in these murals, in a place called Bardo, they illustrated how there would be ritual bloodlettings. Here's a warrior cutting his own penis to give blood to the tree of life. And they did this with joy, supposedly, that this was a great honor, that they could offer themselves this way and perhaps survive. You know, in a tropical environment, that's not usually advised. But the paintings are one thing, but these ceramic figures that were found in a site called Gino, which is up on the Gulf of Mexico, they kind of give you a very human expression of these people, whether they were priests or sacrificed or common folk. But we don't have any of their costumes or any of their feather headdresses or anything like that. And these, between the paintings and the ceramics, you get a very vivid sense of the tremendous elaboration of the individual depending on his rank. And so here's a nobleman with his big pierced ears and a Elizabethan collar. It was about this, well, not quite the same time, but it's more realistic than any of the paintings. Then they built tremendous jade masks that were used as funereal masks, which is a point of curiosity, because well, there is jade around here, but they ended up having masks and suits, which were practiced also in ancient China. There are many scholars in Mesoamerica who consider there probably were contacts going back into far prehistory between Chinese or other Asians and these Mesoamericans. Now these are, of course, very valuable, and they are often found on the black market, having been looted from tombs. So there's quite a scramble to save what they have found or will find. There's very little of this gold work left, because the Spanish came in. Whenever they saw it, they would take it and melt it down to doubloons. But they keep finding more in some very deep tombs, and a lot of exquisite metalwork that way. Here's an official they call Batab, his ceremonial headdress and a sort of almost like a Mandarin coat, officiating at some event. But notice he sort of has a beard, which is very unusual for a native in the Americas at the time. Now here's another official who probably has a necklace made out of jaguar teeth or some other wild animal. And this was surmised perhaps to be a wrestler, because he's dressed with sort of a binding that would be good in a combat in the games that they used to play. And some warriors, again from the site in China. They're not very big. They're not quite the size of the terracotta army in China, but they were probably painted brightly and then put into the guard the tomb. Here's an eagle warrior. So the Spanish, when they first came to this part of the world, they were surprised that these large and capable warriors never had any armor. they had feathers instead, which of course does not exactly do much against the Toledo steel or much less other weapons of the modern time. But so they think that a lot of the warfare was mostly ceremonial. It was almost as if they all get dressed up and make a lot of noise, and then they would sit down and make an agreement, or if it came to battle, then they would enslave the other people. And this was unfortunately illustrated in many of the murals and in parts of the Mayan ruins here. So here are different warriors bringing slaves to offer to the Lord, with a full description on the top. You see the logogryphs all along the side. So here are the slaves being taken in for their fate. See that red ochre mask is on the warrior, and then the slaves are looking none too happy, except when they were offered as a sacrifice. And again, bloodletting and even death was sort of celebrated. And it was maybe they weren't so afraid, but this sacrificial fellow on his knees doesn't look unhappy to be about to be sacrificed. And there are many illustrations of pulling the heart out of people. Now, this was the religious sacrifice, where they would sacrifice children, captives, and take them up on the altar and disembowel them live, and that was then given as a living offering to the gods. They would use this kind of a jade knife, which is very complicated how you would make that. So these were holy objects that were specifically used for disemboweling people, and would be held by the priests as they did their dirty work. But that's quite a piece of surgical instrument. And some people got caught in the moment. I mean, this is a figurine, but pretty emotional, I'd say. And so this life-death duality was so present in the Mayan world that's why the Mayan popular culture has a reputation for being so bloodthirsty and kind of crazy, really. And this is illustrated in much of their remaining effigies and paintings and sculptures. Well, this was Chacmul at Chichen Itza, and that was the site where they would lay somebody down and ritually sacrifice them. Now it's a selfie sacrifice. And then there's a lot more underground. Where we were in Quirigua, the local guide said there's a much more underground, because the tradition was once a new conqueror would come in, they would raise what was there and then build a higher mound and then put more on. Not unlike the ancient Middle East, where there's layers of civilization going back centuries and all. Nothing in Mesoamerica is quite as old as Ur or Babylon. At least they haven't found it yet. They keep finding older remains. The earliest is about 120 BC. But they think that they can find more with new techniques. So there's quite a bit down below, but they try to keep people from digging into it. One of the later, more recent discoveries have been in these deep cave systems. This whole area, particularly as you go further north into Yucatan, is this limestone karst with great hollow caverns, and now spelunkers have been going in and finding more and more graves and sacrificial offerings. I came on a trip here a number of years ago, and we went into the jungle and went climbing into one of these caves, and it was a pretty muddy, rough trip. And then inside it's totally dark and cool, and we found what is typical there are ceramic basins laid out under the drips from the ceiling. So you have stalactites, and they would collect the water that they considered the water from the gods, because it had never been out in the light of day. It actually seeped out of the mountains, so it was holy water, and they would take that for rituals in the altars and in the towns. But in one of these caves they found out on a slab at a place that took a great deal of effort to get in with modern equipment, a skeleton laid out of a young girl who had been ritually dismembered and sacrificed alive. And the scholars were thinking this, they dated the site at about 900 AD. And this was the time when the forest had been cut down so much that there were droughts and they just didn't have enough water for the population they had grown up. So they think that some of these sacrifices were to the rain god, but in the depth of the cave, hoping that that would make an effect and answer their prayers. Well, this is also seen in these, what they call the cenote, which are big sinkholes in the limestone, particularly up in the north, Chichen Itza and other places, where there'll be an opening in the rock and then a pool that goes far down. And this is the main ritual cenote for that complex at Chichen Itza. And back again when some of the explorers came, they had the local Mayan people build this kind of tremendous ladder to go down and see what was in it, because the Mayans said, oh, there's treasure in there. And it was true. They used these to throw offerings to the gods and then also human sacrifice. So in various of them, they've gone down like this and then come up with lots of human remains and also jade and gold and things. So until recently, you couldn't possibly go down there and go excavating, but now they keep finding more and more in these crystalline waters deep under the land. Well, the other development that Mayan culture developed well before many others was astronomical techniques. So many of these sites have an observatory with openings and sighting slits in the rocks for solstices, the Venus and rising and the moon, and they were able to predict astronomical events, eclipses and lunar motions very carefully and in detail, because they had the mathematical system and then they developed measurement for astronomical observations. So this is the caracol at Chichen Itza, which has these various light patterns that will come in only at certain times. Particularly December winter solstice was the most important date of the year, because that's when the cycle of time and seasons came, and then it started over again, just like a lot of other rituals at the end of the year for the beginning of the light in the year. So the Mayans, with this mathematical astronomical knowledge, developed a calendar called Imik, which was 20 months of 13 days, which meant that they had extra days mostly dedicated to ceremonies, and then a